He says, you don't want to be an outlaw. It's a miserable life. You can't stay at home. You're sleeping on your gun. You've got a horse ready to go all the time. He mentally in his head, he knew that the day that they go rob a bank, they were in a different level and they were never going to be able to come back.
You are listening to Gunslinger's Shadow, an outlaw history podcast about the most prolific Wild West outlaw you've never heard of, Bill Long. Hello and welcome back. We are going to be talking a little bit more about Bill Long's identity today, but in order to do so, we kind of have to step back a little bit. Dad, you've got a story specifically.
Ursel Nye.
In
the early years when we were researching, I had no clue which direction to go, and we was looking all over the place for any kind of information. Then I was able to find this lady by the name of Ursel Nye. She's I found through the years that my favorite people to interview was these really old ladies, because all the men were all died off, and she was one of them, and she was just awesome. But she was also very protective, because it was her grandpa. Bill Long was her grandpa. She knew him, and she was trying to protect information, and she kept insisting that he was not an outlaw. He was not an outlaw. Finally, at the very end, she finally said, as I was walking out the door, she says, "Look at the McCartys." Okay. And I was like, whoa, and that kind of hit me hard. So here I am spending 20 minutes after driving away from there thinking the McCartys. So my grandma told me that, Ursel Nye told me that. Maybe it's time to look at the McCartys.
So I know that the McCartys are like Wild West outlaws in Utah in the West. I can't imagine traveling that much on horseback, but
wait till you hear this story today, Adam.
Yeah. So actually, what the McCartys are is they're like they're in a very unique set of people that if you look at Western outlaws overall, and there starts to be a pattern that develops.
Yes, just to kind of as a general sense, the McCartys are not really very well known. John and Donna Scavlan wrote two really good books, In Pursuit of the McCartys, and of course the one on Hank Vaughn. I met John and his wife, but they're both passed on now.
If you think about outlaws overall in Utah and the West, there's all kinds of stories about all kinds of outlaws, down from the smallest thief to the biggest bank robbery and train robbery. And the McCartys, they are more or less the founders, I would say, of what it meant to be an outlaw in the Wild West.
Yes, in particular, Tom McCarty. Yeah.
Right. I mean, this guy's character is he's insane. He scares people. He's volatile. You just don't know what this guy's going to do. And
fearless?
Yeah, he's completely fearless, almost to the degree of psychopathy, in my opinion. At least that's what the image he wanted to portray to those he was robbing. We believe that there's a direct connection between the McCartys and Bill Long. And I think that's the reason he became an outlaw. But let's talk about the McCartys and sort of the origins first.
Okay.
So Alexander McCarty, right? He's Tom McCarty and Bill McCarty's father. And he is a doctor in the Civil War. And then they move out west. And I think originally they passed through Montana, but they end up in Grass Valley, Utah, which Grass Valley, Utah is directly adjacent to Wayne County. We've talked about Wayne County a few times, and that's where Dad lives. But they have a ranch long before Mormon folks moved this far south.
Well, now the original McCarty Rancho was actually right on top, real close to...
It's Otter Creek
Reservoir? Otter Creek Reservoir, just real close to Antimony.
Right.
So if you go north a little bit, for those that are interested, it's pretty close to south of Cashuram.
On the 1870 property survey, and you can find this online, it shows Grass Valley, and the only two houses that it shows are the McCarty Rancho house and the Maxwell house, which Bill McCarty ended up marrying Letty Maxwell. And the houses on the survey are right next to each other. Dad and I actually took our metal detector down there, and we walked around for 3 hours trying to find any evidences of these cabins where they're marked. But unfortunately, where the cabins are marked, it's farmland, so it's been tilled under.
We do think we found the Maxwell original site.
That's true.
Because there was some posts still there. The McCarty site, nothing there.
They had a bunch of cattle, and they moved in this case to central Utah, and they ran their cattle all over central Utah for the feed, and then they would sell it for, that's how they were going to make their riches, right? And the McCartys are part of that group. So there's Alexander McCarty and Ann Farmer, the mom, and then Tom McCarty. John Thomas is his name. John Thomas McCarty is the oldest. There's also William McCarty, hereby known as Bill McCarty, and they have a few sisters as well. They're all living in Grass Valley, Utah, starting in the 1860s. And this is during the time of Mormon expansion into southern Utah. So they're settling all kinds of areas. This particular area hasn't been settled by Mormons yet. Right,
That's
Ed?
exactly right. Yep. Yeah, in fact, at the time, I don't think antimony was there either. I think that
No, it wasn't.
it was, and of course the reservoir wasn't there. So they just had the whole valley to themselves.
The McCartys were there 10 years before anybody else.
Ooh.
Yeah, and it's crazy too to think about some of the Mormon stories. Mormon polygamy is at its strongest right now. There's lots of families, including some of our ancestors, who had multiple wives and lots of children. And this area was completely lawless. I think the law was the church, really, at the time. It was Brigham Young, more or less. And this whole time, the McCartys are living further south into the frontier, doing just fine. And I think it's partially because these guys are rough characters.
On the edge of law. Yep. They were staying on the edge of civilization because that's where they could get away with doing what they were doing. Doc Alexander, he was, they came from Iowa out to Montana, and then they started buying and selling horses and dealing with livestock. And they were coming down to the time when the Johnston's army was coming after the Mormons, and they were selling horses to the Johnston's army, interestingly enough.
The McCartys?
Yes.
Oh, that's an interesting piece of history.
Yeah, that's a little side note. But
so the McCartys, not being Mormon, are kind of on their own. And
they liked it that way.
And they liked it that way, and then they eventually left Utah. But first, they ended up having a problem with the Native Americans, the Navajo tribe specifically. So, Dad, can you talk about that?
Yeah,
one?
I'd be glad to. So while they were living there in Grass Valley, a group of Navajo came up from Arizona, and they did this quite often. They were basically on a hunting excursion, and there was not a big group. I think there was 4 of them, and they were warriors, and they were young, and their objective was to bring home food. And so they came up and spent some time up at Fish Lake, and they were not successful at getting any animals, and so they decided to start coming back down, and they started coming through Grass Valley. And they come upon the McCarty Rancho and some of their cows. And so they decided to just shoot one of their cows. That was a no-no, because what happened then, this guy by the name of Klinger, living in Grass Valley in the northern end, not too far from Kashurim, he sees the dead cow and realizes the Navajos killed that cow. And so he goes down to the McCarty Rancho and says, "Hey, these guys killed your cow." And that was bad news for the Navajos. And so Tom and Bill, and they chased them down, found them, and a shootout ensued. And when everything got done, there was 3 dead Navajo Indians and 1 wounded Indian. But anyway, so this one surviving wounded Indian, of course, he went back to Moenkopi in Arizona. And when he gets there, of course, they go to this chief, and I don't know if it was his son. His son was involved with it. And so when he finds out that his people got killed, and he got really angry, super angry. And so he decided to get even with those Mormons. And so he was going to take his warriors, a group of them, and he was going to go kill and get even with the number of killings he had with the town of Perea, which had nothing to do with the whole story.
It wasn't even the Mormons. It was the McCartys.
Yeah, it was the McCartys, exactly. And so somewhere along the line, of course, the word got back to Brigham Young, and so he sent word to St. George, to one of his leaders, Jacob Hamlin, and later Jacob Hamlin wrote that it was the scariest thing he ever did in his whole life. And so he rides down to Moenkopi, and he immediately gets took right into the chief's presence, and they were going to kill him. They didn't want nothing to do with him. They were going to get even with him. And he says, no, we got to talk. And it was just nip and tuck for multiple days. Jacob thought for sure he was going to get killed.
Oh, man, that would be terrifying.
Eventually, after about 3 or 4 days or so, Jacob Hamlin finally convinced them that the killers of his Navajo people, his Navajo warriors, was the McCartys, and they were
Gentiles.
And so he says, so Jacob says, I'll tell you what we'll do, and I'll be glad to do it with you. In the spring, let's go together, and we'll take you up to Grass Valley, and I'll show you the McCartys, and we can even address them direct if you'd like. But just be aware they were not the Mormons. And then they did get to an expedition together. They went up there. They got within a short distance, and I'm assuming that the chief probably heard some of the character of Tom McCarty and got a little bit scared, and he decided to let the whole thing go. And so they dropped it and abandoned the trip. Brigham Young gets word of what happened there and looks at the bigger picture, and he sends Porter Rockwell, and he says, hey, we need to put this thing, we got to get these guys out of our territory. We don't know the conversations. I'd love to know. Because, boy, you got two tough guys talking to each other, man. Woo.
I mean, we don't even know if there was a conversation. I mean, Porter Rockwell had a reputation as, I mean, he has a history with, the founder of the LDS Church, Joseph Smith. He has a very strong history with Joseph Smith and with other things that had happened before the Saints moved out to Utah, right? That puts Porter Rockwell very solidly into the whole pantheon, I guess, of Western outlaws. Porter Rockwell is like the top of the top. And so when he comes looking for you, I don't know that he even has to talk to you. I don't know if he even actually has to come looking for you. People just have to say he is. And at that point, I mean, anybody's going to jump town, right?
Hey, he earned that avenging angel status.
In the Scovlin book, he talks about Brigham Young being perplexed about this particular issue for the better part of 6 months. So the Brigham Young, the president of the church, he's thinking about, what do I do about the McCartys? Right? For this whole time. And he doesn't send Jacob Hamlin. He doesn't send, any one of our family or any member of the church except for one guy.
Yeah.
Porter Rockwell, because he knows that if he sends him, the McCartys will be like, okay, you know what? We're a rough guy. You're a rough guy. You guys want us to leave. You're taking over Utah. We're just going to go.
Yeah, so Brigham Young he's the message sent essentially was kick him out of our territory. So Utah was not a state. He just did not want them in their neighborhood.
I think the word he used there was, get them out of the land of Zion, right?
Yeah. The McCartys did move, and they did relocate. But for the most part, like Bill McCarty goes down to Monticello area, which is still in the Zion. But
he didn't leave. and Tom McCarty more or less became an outlaw. And let's go with Tom McCarty for just a little bit, because I think he's the most peculiar one of the bunch. He ends up marrying a Mormon girl by the name of Tinny Christensen. And that name is familiar to outlaw folks because her brother is
Matt Warner.
Yeah, Matt Warner, Willard Christensen. So Tom marries his sister, and for a little while he does try to be a rancher, but eventually he gives that up, and he goes across the entire West, mostly wrestling cattle. But let's talk just for a minute about what the Scovlands in their book, the McCarty book, they call it the long ride. Tom's ride all the way from southern Arizona through Utah, being chased by a posse.
Yeah, I can cover it pretty quick. So Tom, Matt Warner, and a guy by the name of Joshua Sweat, and he was not a outlaw, but an aspiring outlaw, and he was from Panguitch, okay? And so the three of them was down there in southern Arizona. Kind of an interesting story, but glossing over it, they had wrestled a large group of cows, and they had delivered it to this broker that was going to put it on the train and take it back east somewhere. In the meantime, there's a group of posses that was gathering to try to catch these guys, and so they started heading north, and the posses got their trail. And this location where it started was somewhere in southern Arizona, not too far from Nogales. So you got to picture that distance and the size of the state of Arizona. And it was a life and death, seriously hard and difficult ride. And so the outlaws, they had not only their horses, but they had backup horses. And so they had a string. So they had 2 or 3 horses per outlaw. And in 4 days, they go from southern Arizona all the way up to Lee's Ferry on the Colorado River, almost into Utah. The posse caught up with them. They had a shootout, and Josh Sweat gets shot. He gets not mortally hit, but close to it. It actually goes through part of his lung. And at that point, they were somewhere north of Flagstaff, and they had to keep riding. And so he kept riding even though he was half dead. And they have to get up to Lee's Ferry before the posse does, or else they're not going to get across the Colorado River, and that would be devastating for him. And they get across the river, and they threaten him with his life, and they start heading up the cliffs up behind there. And then posse comes really shortly after that. According to instructions, couldn't get across, so that stopped the chase. Then they dropped off the Josh because he was not doing well at a doctor in Kanab, and then the other 2 just went north and ended up in Frisco.
Man, you got to wonder about these doctors in the Wild West. You know, they're just these people just come in like every other week with like 5 bullet holes in them. You know.
All right, what'd you do this time?
Should I be fixing you up?
They couldn't. You know, I'm assuming what they did is they probably come in at gunpoint and say, "Well, you're going to fix me if you like it or not, and don't tell anybody. And by the way, we're not going to pay you probably."
That is an insane ride, because I mean, when you're looking at the distance there, it's like at least 300 or 400 miles. It's a huge distance.
About 400.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Those people were hard as nails to be able to survive all that.
When we dug up Bill Long's bones, and the anthropologist did that test, and that's why it was the strongest set of bones he'd ever tested. So referring to Bill Long being the strongest man that he had ever tested. Because, I mean, when you spend all of your time on that horseback, and by the way, they didn't you can't go that far on one horse. There's no way a horse can do that. And so that's why they had the pack string. So they would go one horse as far as they could, then they'd rotate them back without any weight on them, and then they'd kept rotating the horses, and they probably did 2 or 3 of them. I don't know how many. And that's how they was able to cover the 400 miles in 3 or 4 days.
I actually think it's a little bit comical, because in the Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid movie, they have a large portion of the movie dedicated to the chase.
Yeah,
Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and they were more or less Robert Parker and Harry Longabaugh, if that's the names we want to go with.
Really.
Were chased a few times by posses, of course, but not anywhere near this long. So the McCartys, they end up going to Baker, Oregon. Bill McCarty actually buys a ranch in Haines, Oregon, north of Baker City, just a little ways.
Yes, and Doc, his dad, ended up in Myrtle Creek also about the same time frame.
But there's no bank robberies, train explosions, nothing like that. And until they get up to Oregon, the McCarty sister, little sister, Lois McCarty, ends up marrying a man named Hank Vaughn. And Hank Vaughn becomes part of the outlaw team with Bill and Tom McCarty.
Enter Hank Vaughn.
Hank Vaughn was born in Oregon, 1848. And his entire young life, very interesting character, small guy, something like 5'3" and 120 pounds. He is stealing horses and moving them from northern Oregon through Washington to Idaho. And he sells them to the Nez Perce. And at some point, he's 16 years old, and he gets caught. They find out that there's some cowboys that are stealing horses. And so there's a sheriff and his deputy. They go by themselves up into the Blue Mountains. They sneak into their camp, and Hank Vaughn and one of his buddies by the name of Burns are asleep. And according to the newspaper article, the sheriff comes up and pulls the blankets off of him, and Hank stands up shooting. And he kills the deputy immediately.
So he goes from sleeping
Yeah.
to killing the deputy in a second.
I mean, that's exactly right. They throw the blankets off. He's up and shooting. Kills the deputy instantly, shoots the sheriff through the jaw, and Hank and his buddy escape. He eventually gets caught.
The sheriff, but
Well,
they got that song backwards. So that's where Hank Vaughn, he goes to jail in Oregon. They catch him. He goes to jail for the murder of the deputy and the shooting of the sheriff. He's in there something like 5 or 6 years. And there's 800 signatures that are signed and sent to the governor of Oregon for Hank Vaughn's release for this, 20-something. It's just such an and later on, he becomes a very famous person, Hank Vaughn, in Oregon. But at this time, killed a deputy and injured a sheriff and wrestled a lot of cattle and stolen horses. And he moves down to Nevada, and he marries a McCarty sister, Lois McCarty. And then the McCartys and Hank Vaughn go up to Baker, Oregon, Pendleton area, and they hire a bunch of cowboys to do their bidding. And they are stealing horses, stealing cows. At the time, the cattle industry in southern Washington and northern Oregon is the best cattle herds in all of the West. And they're making good money doing this. And meanwhile, Bill McCarty has a ranch in northern Oregon.
Right by
and
Baker.
By Baker. And I think the reason why I brought all these stories into one place with Hank Vaughn is that there's a point here where they make a decision to escalate their activity from stealing cows and horses to let's go rob banks.
It's a different level.
Right.
This is an interesting point. There is a set of papers that supposedly Tom McCarty wrote later on in his life about himself. And in those papers, he says, you don't want to be an outlaw. It's a miserable life. You can't stay at home. You're sleeping on your gun. You've got a horse ready to go all the time. He mentally in his head, he knew that the day that they go rob a bank, they were in a different level and they were never going to be able to come back. So, and it's interesting the way he puts it. As a wrestler, he could come back and try to be a straight person. But he knew that once he gets into the bigger boy stuff, that they were not going to be able to come back from that because people are going to want them dead.
Yeah, boy, did he get into it.
Yeah.
That is something to mention, though. The land barons were also very strongly tied to a lot of these banks, right?
Yes.
Well, that's an interesting note. I didn't really think about it that way. But yeah, if they have money, they have land. They're keeping their money in the banks. And I think the McCartys probably justified themselves this way. And maybe more of the outlaws too. Okay, we're going to go rob this bank. We're going to get what amounts to today is anywhere from 50 to hundreds of thousands of dollars. And I don't know that they needed justification because these guys were wild people. But if they needed any justification, it was, we're going to take the money from these rich people from the banks. We're not taking it from these little guys who don't have any money. We're taking it from the rich guys.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and interestingly enough, there was a lot of just common folk around that would support Butch Cassidy and all of that group because they was doing that. Because in their minds, these rich people that are exploiting the lands were kind of taken over, and they didn't like that, and so they were almost behind the outlaws to a certain extent, quite a few. And you got to picture first that all of these younger guys, Harry Longabaugh, Robert Parker, Butch Cassidy, all these, they were younger guys. Tom McCarty, he was probably 10 years older than them. And Tom was experienced in this stuff, but none of the others were. And so really it was Tom that was bringing the experience to Telluride.
So as Tom McCarty is traipsing across the West, doing his outlaw deeds, at some point he ends up in Denver, Colorado. And I have an article up from 1889, April 6th. So he rides into Denver and he gets the information about some bank that has a lot of money. And he knows the name of the bank president. His name is David Moffett. So he's done his research. And I'm just going to read from the article because it's pretty awesome. The article is titled, "A Neatly Planned Holdup." The boldest and most successful bank robbery ever reported in the West was perpetrated upon the First National Bank at Denver on Friday afternoon of last week, by which a robber succeeded in getting away with $21,000. On the morning mentioned, a well-dressed man with a light mustache and complexion and of medium height walked into the bank and asked the assistant cashier where he could see Mr. Moffett, the president of the bank. He was admitted to the president's private room and briefly stated that he had discovered a conspiracy whereby the First National Bank was to be robbed of a large amount of money. Mr. Moffett told the man that he was very busy at the moment, but would be pleased to meet him at his private office in the bank at 1 o'clock. The man then left the building. A few minutes after the hour appointed, he called to the bank and was shown to the president's office. While remaining standing, he inquired if cashier S.N. Wood was in, and he was told that he was at lunch. He then asked for a blank check for the purpose of showing how the robbery was to be perpetrated. The check was handed him. He laid it upon the desk in front of Mr. Moffett and said, "I will have to do this myself," and pulled a large revolver from his coat. He placed it at Mr. Moffett's head, and in a decidedly earnest but unexcited manner said, "I want $21,000, and I'm going to have it. I have considered this matter and the chances I am running and the consequences if I fall and I am arrested. I am penniless and a desperate man, and I have been driven during the past week to that point where I have considered suicide as the only means of escape from the poverty and misery which I exist in," which, by the way, he wasn't. This is just a bit of madness, right? He's not penniless. In fact, his family has a good bit of money, and all the pictures we find of the McCartys, they're wearing nice clothes. They have lots of cattle. Like, he's doing fine. "You have millions," he continues, "and I am determined to have what I have asked for or your life. If you make a noise, call a man, or ring a bell, I will blow your brains out and then blow up the building and myself with this bottle of glycerin," which he at that moment pulled out of another pocket. "Now take your choice."
Oh, man.
Okay, so there's another article that I'm not going to pull up, but later on they find the overcoat that he's wearing, that he had his gun and the bottle of glycerin, and they say that in the bottle he has sweet oil. It's a complete bluff. It's a complete bluff. This guy is acting like a crazy person. He has a bottle that he says is glycerin. He has a gun, puts it to Moffett's head and says, "Give me $21,000. Moffett goes on to argue with him just for a moment and then decides better for his life if he just gives him the $21,000. He gives him the money, and Tom makes his escape. And no one ever finds out who robbed that bank. The only reason why we know it's Tom McCarty is because later in his life, he told a friend of his all about this bank robbery. So, very interesting story.
Wow. Well, if you think about that, he did that by himself. He didn't have getaway. He didn't have backup. He just went in there brazenly and did the whole thing. He didn't have to split it with anybody. And you got to keep in mind something that it's kind of hard for us to kind of get our heads around. $21,000. So this is 1889. Years ago, and I haven't looked lately, it was about 1% in value of today. And so that basically would mean $2 million equivalent of it. And if you add that to the bank robbery and Telluride coming up in about 6 months, and you add that all together, the two of them combined are over $4 million of today's
I'm curious why he targeted that particular bank. And I wonder, I don't know if this is part of his character, but it's possible that he knew that someone's money was in that bank. It's possible. We should do some research on that. But so that was in March, the end of March, 1889. And fast forward just a couple of months, and now Tom McCarty's back again with some buddies, his brother-in-law, apparently Robert Parker, and another man, Burt Madden. And they ride down to southern Colorado, southwestern Colorado to Telluride. And this is a more famous, even though it wasn't as successful if you divide up the money, and some of them got ID'd, but they robbed a bank at Telluride.
You know, they also think that Robert Parker's brother was involved with that one. Of course, we know that Tom was there, and he probably laid out the groundwork for it. So they was probably there for a week or a week and a half, an extended period of time, checking everything out. Mm-hmm. And so they would watch the patterns of people, what time the bank opened, what time it closed, who was coming, who was leaving, what kind of deposits were making. They were looking for a big deposit, and so they had a lot of money at the time when they went in to do the robbery. And so they did a lot of homework, and they had predetermined how they were going to accomplish it. So I'm sure they probably went through in their camp their practices, and you do this and you do that. This is your role, and this is my role, and each person had their role.
So it sounds to me like the Telluride robbery was a lot more planned than the Denver robbery, right?
Yeah.
And I have this little article. It's titled "The San Miguel Bank Robbery," and it says, on June 27th, 1889, the bold bank robbery at Telluride on Monday is still the all-absorbing topic of conversation. Until this afternoon, no authentic account beyond a few telegrams could be obtained. So, again, they just have no idea. It's a local resident, and he said, just prior to my return to the office, a party of 4 men dressed as cowboys rode into town and stopped at the brewery. From this point, they mounted their horses and rode directly to the bank. All dismounted, leaving their horses standing, and started for the bank. 3 of them entered, the 4th standing and leaning against the door, his hand resting on his hip, but in a manner to disclose his gun. Most people think it was Tom McCarty outside the bank keeping people out. But so Tom McCarty by himself robs the First National Bank in Denver, and then about 2.5 months later, they rob with a group of guys the bank down in Telluride.
And that group of guys includes, Robert Parker, right? That's Butch Cassidy.
So they have turned the tables on what they're willing to do at this point. And the McCartys go back up to Oregon. I mean, I say these loosely because they're kind of all over the place. But Tom McCarty, Matt Warner, and apparently Robert Parker go back up to northeastern Oregon and proceed to rob a few different banks: Wallowa, Walla Walla, Enterprise, Roslyn, which we're going to talk a lot about, and not just rob banks. They also held up a train,
stagecoach.
That they made a plan to rob the Geeser Grand Hotel in Baker City. So they had entered what you might term as like their official outlaw days, and it would come to their demise eventually.
But before it does, I think Bill Long comes into the picture somewhere in there, right?
Ah, yes, Bill Long. Where does he come into this picture? And the answer is, we're going to tell you in the next episode. But he was one of the cowboys that the McCarty brothers and Hank Vaughn picked up to do their work, rustling cows and horses, moving them and selling them out of state, and training them to be outlaws. And that's where our grandfather, Bill Long, learned to be an outlaw. He took those skills that he was taught, and he became one of the most notorious and secretive outlaws that the West has ever known. So stay tuned, and we're going to give you the whole scoop. All right.
Same time, same place. Do this again.
Thank you for listening to Gunslinger's Shadow. We hope you enjoyed this episode and learned something new about one of the most mysterious and elusive outlaws of the Wild West. If you have any information about Bill Long, the Robbers Roost Gang, or any other Western outlaws from the late 1800s, maybe you are a descendant of Bill Long, or of the Parker family, the Butch Cassidy family, the McCartys, or just have family stories that have been waiting generations to tell, we want to hear from you. Your story may well be the missing link that turns fiction into facts. We are right now actively researching the origins of Bill Long and the other outlaws he knew. So please, send us an email with the stories you want to share. We'll read every message and respond as soon as we can. Don't forget to subscribe on whatever platform you listen to, and join us for our next episode to find out the real story behind the real outlaws of the real Wild West.